I was introduced to the writings of Sarban by Mark Valentine sometime in the 1990s. Sarban had published 3 books: Ringstones and Other Curious Tales, which collected 5 stories, The Sound of His Horn, a novella, and The Dollmaker and Other Tales of the Uncanny, a novella and 2 other tales. All were published between 1951 and 1953. I found them beguiling, beautifully written, but quietly shocking. All that was known of Sarban was that he had worked in the East and longed for England. Readers and researchers wrote to Sarban care of his publishers and were given only a little information. His real name was John William Wall. He suggested that the 3 books were all that he cared to have published, which was somewhat misleading. We now know that Sarban had a working-class background, being born in 1910 in Mexborough in the West Riding of Yorkshire, and that he went up to Cambridge University in 1930 to study English literature. In the summer of 1933 he sat the civil service examinations, and by the November he joined the Levant Consular Service. He was in Casablanca in 1947 when he began writing the first of the stories which would be included in Ringstones. In January 1948 he gave his wife, Eleanor, copies of A Christmas Story and Ringstones, and she sent them to Peter Davis. Sarban kept these typescripts and manuscripts, which alas are not mine, and they belong to the estate of Sarban, which I administer. Peter Davis loved the stories, but pointed out that short story collections did not sell well, and asked if the author had written anything longer. The resulting novel, Paul Wenzel, later called Discovery of Heretics, was not accepted. It was even rejected a second time in the 1960s when his other books were becoming commercially reprinted. This is the proof copy of Ringstones, with corrections in the author's own hand. Ringstones was published on the 14th of March 1951, and 5,000 copies were printed. 1,500 of these were for the American publisher Coward McCann, who rebound them and published them under their own imprint. 3 of the stories in Ringstones have a Near Eastern setting, and there is one set in each of his 3 most recent postings, Tabriz, Jeddah and Cairo. 2 are set in Britain, Northumberland and the East Riding of Yorkshire. Sarban wrote, in a letter to Mike Ashley, "I certainly had a liking in my youth for stories of fantasy and the supernatural, H.G. Wells and Walter de la Mare, for example, and no doubt that liking prompted me to choose that vein when I attempted something of my own." We know that he also admired Arthur Machen, whose Tales of Horror and the Supernatural was one of the few books in his library in which he wrote his own name. Ringstones was well received. The short story Capra was reprinted in Argosy magazine, but Ringstones did not sell well and was remaindered. But Peter Davis was undeterred, as Mark Valentine points out in his biography, Time of Faulkner. He had received typescripts of The Sound of His Horn and The Dollmaker from Sarban, and said to the author that they read marvellously. It was decided to publish The Sound of His Horn as a separate short novel because it was so striking, which it certainly is, and it was subsequently reprinted in increasingly garish paperbacks through the 1960s and 1970s. It is beautifully written, and it is an exciting and very imaginative adventure yarn. It imagines an alternative or parallel universe in which the Nazis had won the Second World War, and in which humans are hunted for sport. The Sarban archive also includes illustrations drawn by Sarban's wife, Eleanor. We have no idea whether Sarban had read Murray Constantine's very bleak Swastika Night, and there were, and have been, of course, other novels with a similar premise, such as Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle. The Sound of His Horn is quite original, not least because, and there's no getting away from it, there is a certain erotic element, if not a kinkiness. The element of bondage that was formerly in the story Ringstones is repeated here. Sadly, both publisher and author thought that the reviews of the book were poor, as were the sales, and again the book was remaindered. The Sound of His Horn very nearly had another life as a film. A Californian producer, Nat Goldstone, appears to have bought the rights, but we can find no copy of the contract. Others have sought to acquire the film rights, but all the time that Goldstone's contract may exist and might potentially give the holder rights in perpetuity, nobody, understandably, will take the risk. The Sound of His Horn was followed by The Dollmaker. This is the proof copy, and here the first edition. The Dollmaker is a very effective and creepy story about control and power, even if there is no overt bondage in it. 2 further stories were added to the first edition, here in typescript and manuscript: The Trespassers and The House of Call. These extra 2 stories were omitted from the 1960s paperback reprints. Once again, The Dollmaker could have been better reviewed, and it was remaindered. And that would appear to have been that. For many years, readers and researchers assumed that Sarban wrote no more, but he did write, and for many years he was composing a long, complex fantasy called the Gynarchs, which, as far as we can tell, was never submitted for publication. It occupied his time while he was posted to South America, and explores a world in which women are dominant and men are subservient and mainly off-stage. The main problem with publishing it was that it never seems to have been finished, despite copious notes and drafts. Sarban returned to England finally in 1966, ostensibly to retire, although he worked as an Arabic tutor for the Government Communications Centre, GCHQ, in Cheltenham, on and off, for about 6 years. This photo shows Sarban in his later years with his daughter Jocelyn, later Lady Leighton, and to us, Joss. John Wall died, aged 78, in 1989. Back in the 1990s, none of the literary researchers we approached, neither Mark Valentine, Mike Ashley or Richard Dolby, could give us any information as to the whereabouts of Sarban's estate, and in 1999 Tartarus Press reprinted The Dollmaker in a speculative run of 200 copies. The American researcher, Douglas A. Anderson, immediately put us on to John Wall's daughter, Jocelyn. We sent her our edition of The Dollmaker, and she was delighted with the book. On visiting Joss, I discovered, in a pile of papers, the typescript of the previously unpublished story, The King of the Lake, which we reprinted when we published, now with permission, The Sound of His Horn in 1999. If one had spotted a certain perviness in Sarban before, The King of the Lake delights in bondage and power games, and is again beautifully written. On another trip to see Joss, we discovered the typescript of another unpublished tale, number 14, and added that to a publication of Ringstones in 2000. Again, the story is about power and obliquely about bondage. Even more research in Jocelyn's archives meant that we later collected together all of the completed but unpublished short stories that were published as The Sacrifice and Other Stories in 2002. It included The Sacrifice, The Sea Things, Number 14, and The King of the Lake. Only The Sacrifice is dated to 1951, and the other stories probably date from between 1947 and 1951. I was delighted to introduce Joss to Mark Valentine, and her father's archive was the basis upon which Mark wrote his excellent biography of Sarban called Time of Faulkner, published in 2011, along with Discovery of Heretics. The Discovery of Heretics draws upon manuscripts unfinished and fragmentary. The material in the volume was considered for reference rather than making any claims for it being complete or finished work. It can only really be obtained now through book dealers or interlibrary loans. All of the new stories in The Sacrifice were later reissued with The Sound of His Horn in a new 2016 edition, which is currently in print.